Today is the 10th day of April, 1990, and Crook Stewart, who lives in Orlando, has come out to the Thousand Trails Preserve nearby, and he will be telling his story of life in the Coast Guard as he experienced it. Crook, it's yours.
Okay, well, I'll start even a little earlier than I had intended to originally, and tell you that my real first recollection of the Coast Guard was that as a young fellow about 11 years old, the war put my father out of business in Montgomery, Alabama. He was a salesman for Hobart Manufacturing Company and sold throughout South Alabama heavy equipment for restaurants and grocery stores and whatnot. And they told him he couldn't sell that kind of equipment to anything but war plants and military bases, and so he closed his business, packed his family up in his 40 Ford and drove to Panama City Beach, Florida, where his sister had 3 cottages right on the beach. And for the next 3 years, I got to roam 7 miles of beach that had no cottages, no houses, no roads, just sand dunes and gulf front, while Dad worked at the shipyard in Panama City building Liberty ships. And I know that he carried a card issued by the Coast Guard that would allow him on the beach in wartime. He and my mother were avid fishermen, and of course Dad was a boater too. He got him a boat pretty soon after he got to Panama City. And one of the things that happened during the war was that the beach was patrolled, and sometimes that was done by the Army on foot, but a portion of those 3 years during war there between 42 and 45, it was patrolled by the U.S. Coast Guard. And the way the Coast Guard did it, they took over a hotel, I think it was a Sea Breeze Hotel at Panama City Beach, and they had stalls out there, and they had horses, and they had a big trailer truck, and they had ramps built around at different places. And every evening, a little before dark, the truck would pull up and they'd unload a couple of horses and a couple of Coast Guardsmen, and those guys would ride the beach all night long. Many years later, at the Coast Guard Academy, my assistant sailing coach, Jim Swint, turned out Jim had patrolled the beach on horseback during the Second World War. Well, anyway, quite a few years later, there in Panama City, which is where we stayed, Hobart tried to get Dad to go back to work for them or take an agency. He said he wanted to stay by the water, and they said, well, we have one in Mobile, Alabama. He said, I want to stay in Panama City. So anyway, he went into business for himself. Later had a business called Two Crooks Incorporated, and he became the largest fuel oil dealer in the Panama City area by about 1958 or 59. Anyway, I graduated from high school there in 1950 and got an appointment to the Coast Guard Academy, and so I reported to New London in July of 1950.
May I interrupt a moment?
Sure.
What's the origin of the name Crook?
That was my grandmother's name before she was married. Her name was Mary Lee Crook. They named my father Crook Stewart and me Crook Stewart Jr., and now I have a Crook III. As a matter of fact, I might mention to you here, he left the U.S. for his first trip to Europe on the 2nd of April. He's a tour manager for Joan Baez. He's doing about a 2.5-month tour over Western and maybe a little bit of Eastern Europe this spring and summer. So he was tour manager for a 2-month tour this past fall between October and December, and now he's on about a 2.5-month tour in Europe. Like I said, I reported up to New London in July of 1950, and as you well know, probably got one of the best educations that anybody could possibly get over the next 4 years.
And got paid doing it.
That's right, sure did. Got to see a little bit of the world in the process too. That was back in the days when you went on a short cruise at the end of your summer. You went on a long cruise the next summer as the junior class. You went on another short cruise as the senior class at the end of the second year, and then the end of the third year you went on a long cruise as the senior class on the cruise. And our first short cruise took us all along the coast of New England. We went down as far as south as Cape May, New Jersey, and as far north as Bar Harbor, Maine. And we went to places like Boston and New Bedford and Staten Island.
What ships were involved?
Well, actually, as you well know, there was probably one or possibly two cutters in addition to the Eagle. And the cutters that I can remember serving on were the Campbell in particular, and I'm not sure, I don't think the Campbell made that first short cruise, but I'm sure she made my first long cruise. On that long cruise, we hit ports of Portsmouth, England, Amsterdam, Holland, Le Havre, France, and Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. Actually, the Campbell is the only cutter that I can recall now, although I know there were a couple of others that I served on for a third of the cruise or whatever.
Were the others AVPs?
I'm sure at least one was. I wound up on an AVP. Yeah, that's true. No, I was never stationed on an AVP except during cruise. That was the old Navy seaplane tenders, yeah, WAVP. I can remember one thing about them. They had an awful lot of fuel tanks on board because they were able to carry aviation gasoline and everything else, I guess, when they served with the Navy. Our second short cruise with the class of 54 as the senior, let's see, yeah, that would be as a senior class then. We were second classmen. Took us to Bermuda. That was a nice cruise, and we had an incident there that I can't remember enough of to really go into detail, but it seems that some guys didn't like to be sent home by the shore patrol, so they jumped overboard and were going to swim back ashore, and Cadet OD had the boat in the water trying to get these guys out of the water, and it turned into quite a thing. In fact, some of the fellows had to leave the Coast Guard Academy because of that little incident. I thought we lost some good classmates there. Then our last long cruise took us to Oslo, Norway. One of the things I remember about that was, one thing was I happened to be on whatever cutter was the cutter or one of the two cutters in that cadet squadron, and I came off the mid-watch, and the Eagle was north of us, so the sky was still light at midnight because we were up in the high latitudes in the middle of the summertime, headed for Norway, headed for Oslo. And I had an old Argus C3 camera, and I took a sort of a time photograph of the Eagle between me and the light sky. So there was a picture taken with real light at midnight. And it was that was a beautiful country. I'd never been to Norway, but everything was nice and green, summertime. It stayed light until about 11 o'clock at night, and it was light again at 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever, you know. People started moving again early, stayed up late and got up early. We went from Oslo down to Antwerp, Belgium, and took a trip to Brussels. We went to La Coruña, Spain, and again went back to Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. Fueled up then for the trip back across the ocean, the Atlantic. I said something earlier about what a good education you got at the Coast Guard Academy, but it did some other things for you. I think health-wise, it probably, it took me as a hunched-over kid, skinny kid from a small town, and although I didn't weigh a whole lot more when I graduated than I did when I went, at least I could stand up straight and hold my shoulders back, and my teeth were probably in a lot better shape than regular dental care. And I think just health-wise, it probably has paid off for me the rest of my life. And the physical conditioning that we got. There was a period there, at least 1 year, where they woke us up about an hour earlier than normal reveille, and we had to double time down to the waterfront, lower away the monomoy surf boats, row across the river and row back about as fast as we could, hoist the boat, and then double time up the hill. And I can remember we'd just sit there at breakfast and drink a little cool water. Not really, didn't really feel much like eating after that grind every morning.
Well, that was our daily routine.
Well, thank goodness we didn't have it as a daily routine but 1 year. Another one of the great things that happened there, and it helped to make that education so good, was the discipline that you had as far as study was concerned. Because when you couldn't go on Liberty, and when you had to sit there at your desk from 7 o'clock until 10 o'clock each evening, and you didn't have anything else to do but study, it caused you to study. And that helped me immensely, I'm sure, because if I had been able to do something else, I probably would have been doing something else. It turned out I came into the class, I think the first precedence list, I was probably something like 192 out of 215, and I graduated 19 out of 89. So it was a steady process of moving up, and I'm sure the discipline of study caused that to happen to a great extent, and not just the fact that I was a studious person, because that wasn't the case. I always envied those guys like Mark Millay in our class, who was #1 for probably 3.5 of those 4 years we were there, and Kozlovsky, who turned out to be #1 in the end, beat Mark out by a hair, I guess. Those guys, even though they were super smart already, they still studied hard, harder than I did, I'm sure. And I envied them for that. I never have been quite as conscientious as I could have been. But those are some of the things that the Coast Guard Academy itself did for me. When graduation time came, I was anxious to get back down south. I never could understand why anybody wanted to live up in that country where it snowed and whatnot. And I lucked out and got a billet on the Coast Guard cutter Sebago, which at the time was stationed in Boston, but she was already going to move to Mobile to take the place of the old Tampa. And so I went home on leave, missed an opportunity there. I haven't missed many opportunities in my life, but I missed one there. George Wagner, a classmate who I crewed for on the sailing team for the 4 years that we were at the academy, spring and fall every year, fall and spring. We were eight times lettermen, and we're in the monogram club because George was an excellent sailor. In fact, I think he was the best sailor at the academy for 3 of those years. That was after Larry White graduated. Larry was in the class of 51, and as you probably know, Larry's back there as in charge of the sailing program at the academy right now. In fact, I enjoy reading his articles in the alumni bulletin about the sailing. And it looks like things are really catching on this year in sailing. But George invited me to go on the Newport Bermuda race, and I was too homesick, and I went back to Panama City on leave while George took the big boat and raced to Bermuda. And so that was an opportunity I have always kicked myself since for having missed. I went aboard the Sebago in the yard in Curtis Bay, and if you can imagine, after a ship has been through a yard period and you have taken half of the crew from another ship, that is the Tampa, and put them on board, and half the crew that was already on the ship from Boston, and then take it to Newport, Rhode Island for refresher training, we had a mess. And then we had more mess when we got to Mobile. We carried ammunition for most of the ships in the 8th District. We loaded in Norfolk and carried the ammunition in our magazines. And then we traveled along the Gulf Coast over to Gulfport and down to Texas and met cutters like the Cardigan and I forget which cutter was in Brownsville. But one of the 165s was in Gulfport, and we met those ships and offloaded ammunition to them before we actually got to Mobile, where our own station was going to be. When we got there, they didn't have a berth ready for us at Alabama State Docks, and so we wound up for a good long period being tied up to an ammo barge at Brookley Air Force Base, and no shore power. So we had to run the ship service generator all the time to power the ship. And in most cases, in a lot of cases in Mobile, the water was so stagnant and hot that the condensers wouldn't condense enough steam that we could run the air conditioning system. So we had some miserable summers in Mobile. And also, we had a beautiful, brand new set of heavyweight canvas awnings. And blowing tubes and burning the old Navy special fuel from Pensacola at Naval Air Station, where we'd go to fuel. The dew would settle on that soot that had sulfur in it, and within about 6 months, you could take your finger and push it through that canvas. It was terrible. But it was back in the good old days. It was so far back in the good old days, Castro hadn't taken over in Cuba, and so my first summer on the Sebago, we took some Coast Guard Reserve cruisers, 2 of them. I think we took units from Kansas City, if I'm not mistaken, on a 2-week reserve cruise, and the middle weekend we pulled into Havana. So I pulled Liberty in Cuba a couple of times while it was still a nice place to go and visit. I did 3 years then of Campeche patrols, whereas a lot of the East and West Coast ships were pulling weather stations. The ones in the Gulf were pulling Campeche patrols. The American fishermen, several years before I got to Mobile in '54, had discovered shrimp, beautiful large shrimp in the flats on the west side of the Yucatan Peninsula, called the Campeche Flats. Fairly shallow water, sandy bottom, and I understand when they first started traveling down there, and boats went there from Key West, they went from ports in Georgia and ports along Mississippi and Louisiana, and even ports in Texas. When they first started going down there, they could fill a 60-foot shrimp boat with large shrimp in a week. It wasn't quite that lucrative when we got down there. What was happening then, the boats going down would carry fuel and ice, and the boats coming back would bring back shrimp. And the boats would actually work down there for approximately a month. There would be times when you could see as many as 200 boats all around the horizon. They fished at night and slept in the daytime.
Yep.
And of course they would, one boat would anchor in the daytime and a bunch of them would tag on the rear end, so it'd be a string of boats and everybody asleep in the daytime. We would board boats primarily in the daytime, and then we would rest and just watch them at night and try to get between them and the Mexicans when things started going. And one of the things I was going to tell you about was that after I had been on the Sebago for 1.5 years in Mobile, my father had had a heart attack, a very severe heart attack. And as you well know, back in the old days, when a person had a heart attack, it just about put them out of commission. They wouldn't let them do anything, wouldn't climb stairs, tried to keep them from working or whatnot. Well, anyway, while I was home on emergency leave in Panama City, I had a friend from Panama City who was in the class of '53. His name was Albert Pledger, and he was the executive officer on the Coast Guard cutter Cardigan, a 125-footer in Panama City. And he called my mother and told her to have me drop by and see him before I went back to Mobile. So I went by and talked to Albert, and he said, how would you like to have this job I have here on the Cardigan? That was my hometown. I said, that'd be great. He said, well, I've got orders to go to Loran Station, Busan, Korea, and nobody's been named to relieve me. He said, you want to let's write a letter? And I said, yes. So we wrote a letter to headquarters via the 8th District and via the CO of the Sebago, requesting transfer to Panama City due to the circumstances of Dad's health. And we submitted the letter. Later, then, and I wanted to tell you about this too, a program that the Coast Guard had going at that particular time, which I thought was very, very good. After you had spent at least a year on deck as a deck officer on a major cutter in your first assignment, you then rotated through at least Part A, and if you chose, a Part B of engineering training. And so I happened to be in this Part A of engineering training. It was really a period of just getting your hands dirty in the engineering side of the house and getting a taste of it to see whether or not you might want to become an engineer in the Coast Guard. And quite a few of my classmates followed on and did do that. As a matter of fact, I went through the Part A of engineering training, and then we took the ship to Curtis Bay for another yard period. And while we were there, I guess our executive officer at that time was Commander Logan, who had been in intelligence at headquarters and had a lot of friends in the Washington area. And I asked him to check on my request, and he checked for me and told me that they were just waiting until I finished the engineering training to see, what I decided to do, and then they would consider that request. And sure enough, when I completed the Part A of engineering training, and I had a nice letter saying that if I'd ever wanted to, well, they gave me the transfer to Panama City, to the Cardigan, but they also wrote a letter saying that they felt like I'd made that decision because of personal circumstances, and if I ever did want to consider the engineering side of the house again, the request would be favorably received. As it turned out, my father had another heart attack later while I was on Coast Guard Loran Station, and so when I got back from that tour, I did resign the commission and tried to take the family business load off his shoulders. But to go on then with some of the other observations I had about the Coast Guard, I wanted to tell you about the incident when I was the executive officer on the Coast Guard cutter Cardigan. I had two different COs. One was a warrant, had been a warrant boatswain, but he was a lieutenant. And I certainly am sorry that his name doesn't come to me right now. He's deceased now. But he retired in Panama City. And he sent me off with that ship by myself 2 different times. And to tell you what a close crew we had there on the Cardigan, I guess the Cardigan carried a crew of about 30 or 32 men and 4 officers. We had a warrant engineer. We had a lieutenant commanding officer, Lieutenant JG, executive officer, and ensign. So the executive officer was also the navigator, and that was a position I held, and chief admin officer and everything else really, it seemed like. One of the trips I made as acting CO was to take the ship over to Pensacola, where we tied up out on an island that is it's a state park, and it's right across from Naval Air Station. The Naval Air Station had rifle and pistol ranges over there on the island. We stayed there for a week with the whole crew on board, except maybe for a man or 2 we had on leave. We spent that week on the range each day. The evenings we spent fishing or playing baseball or whatnot. And that whole crew stayed on that island and on that ship for a week, and nobody raised the question of going on liberty. That's how close the crew was. Later, we took the ship one other time on a Campeche patrol as acting CO, and at this particular time, the Mexicans were pulling all kinds of things. They were really giving the American shrimpers and the snapper fishermen down in that area. The snapper boats fished on the outer edges of that Campeche bank, where the water dropped off to deep depths. There was a lot of snapper. There were reefs around the edge, and things out there to attract the larger fish. So the snapper boats, which were usually large, like 80-foot schooners and stuff like that, would go down and fish those deep areas, and the shrimpers would trawl in the shallow areas for shrimp. But one of the things that we noticed during this patrol, they had a PCE. The Mexican Navy had a PCE that was patrolling in the area. We called him Smokey Joe because every time he tried to run at high speed, he made a heck of a bunch of smoke. No telling what kind of conditions his engines were in. And it appeared that the way the Mexican Navy ran was whoever was the CO just ran his ship the way he wanted to. It didn't seem like it was an organized thing, it was just whatever happened. They boarded some shrimpers. We had gone on an emergency medical call out to the deep area where a snapper fisherman had gotten hurt in an accident on the ship. And Well, I'll tell you a little bit about Coast Guard Loran Station, Okinawa then.
Sure thing.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
All right.
I'm going out beyond
That's
here.
fine. Went out to Coast Guard Loran Station, Okinawa. Well, as a matter of fact, my dad and I had a long discussion before I went for this year of isolated duty. The way he put it to me is, he said, son, he said, you keep your nose clean and you've got a good career ahead of you in the Coast Guard. You know, we had to discuss whether or not I was going to go into business with him or stay in the Coast Guard or whatnot. And so, like I said, since I was leaving for a year, we had that discussion, and it sort of boiled down to the fact that if I could get into flight training, I was going to make a career out of the Coast Guard. And so on the way to Groton, Connecticut for Loran Indoctrination, or the Loran Officers Indoctrination, which everybody went to as prospective COs of Coast Guard Loran stations, I went through headquarters, which was then on, 1300 East Street, Northwest, and talked to them about the possibility of going into flight training. They said, sure. I said, we don't ever get enough academy officers applying for flight training. So when you get to Okinawa, you just get the Navy to give you a flight physical, and put in your request. And this was later than most people would have done this, see, because that decision's usually made the first couple of years you're in the Coast Guard as a commissioned officer. And quite a few. In fact, I think our class had a higher percentage of flyers than most any class before or since. We had an awful lot of members of our class that went into flight training and became flyers. Anyway,
and your class is 54.
That is a class of 54, right?
Yes.
And you mentioned Ray Copen to me on the phone last night. Ray was one of the flyers. In fact, he lost his wife, I think, while he was stationed at Aviation Training Center in Mobile. And that was probably
He was under
15 or
orders
20 years
to
ago.
catch cam to Annette, and I think he actually got to Annette.
Is that right?
When he lost her.
Okay. Anyway, went through the Loran Officer Indoctrination course at Groton, and then this is an incident I hadn't thought of in a long time. Back in those days, of course, when you went overseas, they didn't hand you an airplane ticket and say, here, go somewhere. You know, you go to a military base and wait for a flight. Well, we probably wound up, I probably flew commercial. Yeah, I flew commercial air somehow out of Mobile, Alabama, because I left that old Argus C3 camera I told you about hanging on the back of the restaurant stool in Mobile, and that was the last time I ever saw it. I came back with a couple of Japanese 35 millimeters when I came back from Okinawa. But I must have flown to California and probably went to Travis Air Force Base and got a military hop. Well, back in those days, these were propeller-driven aircraft. We were probably flying something like an R5D. And they probably could make it all the way to Hawaii, but once we left Hawaii, then they had to make a couple of stops at places like Midway and Wake before they could make it all the way to Japan. And it turned out that there were about 3 or 4 of us out of the class of 54 on that flight, all going to be COs of Loran stations, either probably in the Far East section or the Mariana section, or the Philippines section, which were the 3 sections where we had Loran stations in the Pacific. And it seemed like we had one on every little rock out there. I think it was probably at Midway. Our classmate Jim Fournier was the CO of the Coast Guard Loran station at Midway. And we landed at Midway at like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning to fuel, and they herded us into the restaurant to get something to eat and load us back on the plane plaza. Well, we called up the Loran station and tried to get them to wake the CO up so we could talk to him. I don't think we got to talk to Jim that night. In fact, it seemed to me like he might have even been able to somehow go to an officers club that either belonged to the Federal Aviation Administration, who had a big contingent out there or something, or was someplace else. We thought that was kind of suspicious when the CO of the Loran station wasn't immediately available to the telephone at midnight or whatever it was. Anyway, here's another program that Coast Guard had going right then that probably was a good one. They were making an effort to bring all of their officers of whatever source, whether academy or reserve officer training or what, to about the same knowledge level in different areas. And so they had a program of you had to take at least 2 and no more than 3 correspondence courses a year. And after you completed the correspondence course in various subjects, and the subject matter was determined by your grade level, or your commissioned grade, you had to take an examination administered by an officer senior to you. Well, there was no way that they could have an officer senior to us giving us an exam on our little Iran stations. So the program was that we had to go to Tokyo to take our, actually called promotion exams, I think, but anyway, they were really exams. And if you failed one, you didn't get promoted. It was a tough program because there were some people who actually got permanently out of line of promotion because of that program. And I think later the program was changed just because that was such a traumatic thing to have happen into a career. Anyway, all of us that were going to Loran stations decided that we'd take 3 correspondence courses that year because that meant we got 3 trips to Tokyo. Didn't have to sit on our little rock the whole year without a break. So anyway, my Loran station was on a very small island. It was about 1.5 miles long, about 1/2 mile wide. It had 1,200 Okinawans in a village on the south end of the island, and it had 19 enlisted men and myself on this little Coast Guard station on the other end of the island. We were very close to the native population or the indigenous population because of the fact the island was so little. We were probably about 3 or 4 miles from Okinawa proper.
Offshore.
Yes, we were across what was called Chimawan Bay from Okinawa proper. And the reason my station had as many people on it as it did, that is, most Loran stations had crews that probably ran from 14 to 16, something like that. But I had 2 additional crews. I had an extra engineman and an extra bosun mate because I had an LCM assigned to my station. And that's the way we got all our supplies. I think it was every Monday we would take a 3/4 ton pickup truck, a weapons carrier, M37, drive it down to the beach where our LCM was tied up at a buoy out in a little basin. We'd bring the LCM to the beach, put the ramp down, load the truck on the LCM, go across Chimawan Bay, hit a sandy beach on the far side, and drive that 4-wheel drive vehicle across the beach and down these little sandy rut roads until we finally got to a highway. And then we'd get on the highway and go down to where the military installations were on Okinawa. And I think I counted up one time that we had could possibly have done business with as many as 42 different locations and commands and whatnot on Okinawa. Places like Sukaran, we would go to the post office to pick up our mail. It was an Army post office. We'd go to Kadena Air Force Base to pick up our military payroll every 2 weeks. We'd go to, that was an Air Force base. We would go to the Marine Corps Officers Club in another place to pick up movies once a week. We got 7 movies a week, you know, from the old fleet pool of movies that rotated around all the ships and whatnot. We'd go to a contract dairy to pick up milk and ice cream. We would go to the Navy at Naha to pick up our civilian payroll. We had 2 paid indigenous employees. One assisted the cook, and one, although he was labeled as a laborer or a helper, was actually a dadgum good mechanic, and he did a lot of the lapping of the injectors on the diesels that we ran continuously. We ran 2 GM 671 diesel generators continuously. One powered the Loran station and one provided all the other power. In fact, we had one electric wire that we ran all the way down to that village that I told you about that was probably almost 1.5 miles away from us, down through the boonies, through the farmlands and whatnot. And it terminated at what was called the Cucho, or the mayor's office, Cucho's office. And there it ran a few light bulbs and a community radio system. They had a large AM radio, and the radio itself would just be tuned to one station, and it had a large power amplifier then that this electric wire, the power that we sent from the station down there, because the people had no power. They didn't have any roads. There were no vehicles. There weren't any roads. The only roads on the island went from our station to the village, and from our station to the beach where our boat was kept. And so there were no other vehicles. We had 2 weapons carriers and a Jeep that didn't work when I got there, and it still didn't work when I left. So we had 2 weapons carriers, 2 3/4-ton, 4-wheel drive trucks.
Let me interrupt. You said you had 2 generators running continuously.
Yeah, we had 4 generators.
That was the question.
Yeah, we had 4 generators.
Alternated.
Right, yeah. And they shipped them to us in cans, you know, and we'd, once in a while when we got 10,000 hours or whatever it was, we'd load one in a can and send it back and take a new one out and put it in a spot in the power building. In fact, that was the only permanent type building we had on the station. It was structural concrete building, was the signal and power building. The Loran transmitters and monitor receivers and whatnot were in one end of the building. There was a little admin area right in the middle, and then the other end of it was generators. And the generators, of course, were just cooled by convection. The building had louvered areas in it, you know, so that air could blow through that power end of the building to cool the generators and whatnot.
They're not water cooled.
Well, they probably had water,
Self-contained
water, radiators for themselves, but the air that cooled the water came into the building through vents and whatnot. All our other buildings were Quonset huts. It was still, in fact, Coast Guard Loran Station, Okinawa, which that station was on Ikeshima there, was built while they were still mopping up the operations at the end of the Second World War on Okinawa property. There was still fighting going on. In fact, there was a little, near where our boat was kept, there was a sort of an isolated coral hill like that was almost like another little island, but it was attached like a peninsula. And guys found bones and relics of the war and whatnot in that little piece of ground and trees and whatnot out there. We had some definite friends there on the island that we made over the years. Our radioman taught an English class for some of the kids in the village one night a week. In fact, I taught his class for a while when he left until we got somebody else to take it over when the radioman was transferred after his year of duty there. The main people that we made friends with were, of course, the indigenous employees that we had that worked for us. There was Yesho Momahara and Yesho Maeki were those 2 civilian employees. One was called Junior, that was Yesho Maeki, and Yesho Momahara was the cook's helper. I continued to correspond with those guys over the years after I left the island. And a few years after I left, that station was rebuilt. The Coast Guard, I guess, abandoned the property or turned the property back to the owners and built a new Coast Guard station over on Okinawa proper. I think it's called Gishashi now, something like that. Anyway, I had an opportunity to go back and visit that island 20 years after I had been there, working as an engineer for the U.S. Navy. I was sent on a mission to discuss mine warfare, mine countermeasures in particular, with the Japanese Navy and the industry, Japanese industry. And that was in 1977. Well, I had left Okinawa in 1958, and so that was 20 years, just about. When I found out I was going to Japan, I bought me a round-trip ticket from Tokyo to Naha. I went down to Naha, got down on I was hoping I'd have a whole weekend, but I didn't. I didn't get to fly down until Saturday morning. Made my way down to the central bus station. And of course, everything had changed because when I was there, the U.S., Okinawa was a protectorate of the United States. And it had a high commissioner that was an army general who was like the governor. And all the signs were in English, and, you know, the sign said Tanzania, it said things like Kadena Air Force Base and Naha and whatnot. And in the meantime, after I left Ikeshima and Okinawa, we gave Okinawa back to the Japanese. Well, when that happened, the American presence to a great extent disappeared, although Kadena Air Force Base was still there. But all the signs were in Japanese. I went down to the central bus station and all the signs were in Japanese. And I couldn't figure out what bus to get on to get to Kadena Air Force Base. I finally just opened doors in administrative offices until I found somebody who spoke enough English to tell me what bus to get on to get to Kadena. And I went to Kadena and got a taxi then, a taxi driver that spoke English to take me to one place where I had some friends in Panama City who had asked me to look up an Okinawan photographer friend. So I went by to visit him a little while, and then the taxi took me I could get to within one island of Ikeshima. The island that the Loran station had been on was Ikeshima. There was also, well, it was also called Ichibaneri. Well, there was also Takibaneri and Hachibaneri, I believe it was. But anyway, there were 3 islands out there. They were just north of White Beach, which was the Navy base, really, on probably the northeast side of Okinawa. And back in the days when the Loran station was there, the people that lived on all 3 of those islands could only travel to and from Okinawa by what was called taxi boat, by boat. They were islands. Now, a peninsula has been built from White Beach out to the first island, and then another one from that island to the second island. But the third island, which is where the Loran station was, still is disconnected by several hundred feet of water. So you still have to get on a boat to get to the island. But anyway, I made it back to the island and looked up some old friends. It turned out that one of the storekeepers that sort of doubled as a bar and a hangout for the guys at the station, since they didn't have normal liberty. As you recall, back in the old days, a lot of Loran stations were isolated duty, and you did not have normal liberty. What happened, if you weren't on watch, you could leave the station between about 5 o'clock in the afternoon and 11 o'clock at night, but there was never overnight liberty. You know, you had to be back aboard the station by 11 o'clock. And we used to run the truck down to the village like 3 times a night, like at 5 o'clock and at 9 o'clock or 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. And the guys would freeze a big pan of ice in the freezer all day long. And when 5 o'clock came, they would split the ice in half, and 2 batches of guys would leave the station. One would take it to one store, grocery store, and one would take some ice to another grocery store, and there they could buy soda pop and beer and whatnot. And that was the only ice on the island, too, I might mention. And that routine went the same every day. You know, they'd come back from Liberty that night, the big pan got filled up with water, put in the freezer, you know, so there'd be some ice the next afternoon. But Jensky, a fellow named Jensky, ran one of the grocery stores, and there was a female that ran, Jensky's wife was named Taki. The other grocery store that the guys frequented was run by a female named Sadako, and those were the 2 hangouts for the crew from the Coast Guard station. Well, anyway, when I got back out there 20 years later, Jensky and Taki were still living at the same location. No longer had a grocery store, they had a small hotel there. Jensky was then the mayor, the Cucho of the island. He was also almost blind because he was getting on up in age. And I brought some pictures with me. When we go back to my car, I'll show you some pictures I made that 20 years after I'd been there. Sadako couldn't remember me. But one of the station employees, Yesho Maiki, the one I said was the good mechanic, when the Coast Guard rebuilt the station over in Okinawa, he quit. He didn't go to Okinawa to work. He remained there on Ikeshima, and he had a diving support service. Now the village now has roads, the island has roads, and the old Coast Guard station is now a resort for divers. And it, in fact, has been improved since I was there. I have recently gotten some information about it. It's a very nice hotel now. See, the island had some pretty coral reefs off around the edge. It's a nice place to dive. So Junior, the guy, Yesho, stayed there, now has a business providing services for divers. Yesho Momahara, the one who was the cook's helper, did go ahead and start working for the Coast Guard over on Okinawa. And as a matter of fact, when I was there in 1977, he was still working for the Coast Guard in Okinawa, but he happened to be there at Ikishima because it was a holiday. So I got to see Taki and Jensky and Junior and Yesho, you know, and Sadako. So about 5 of the old friends that I had 20 years before I got to see again. One curious thing, or one interesting thing, in fact, a couple of things. The one familiar face I saw when I got to Loran Station, Okinawa, was a hospital corpsman chief named Steele. Now, I don't know if you ever knew Chief Steele, but when I was a Coast Guard cadet, he was it when it came to Ballard Hall and the athletic teams. He was the trainer. For all 4 years that I was there, Chief Steele was the trainer for the swim team, for the football team, for the baseball team. And you better believe it sure was nice to see that familiar face when I got to Loran Station, Okinawa, because the chief and I actually did all of the administrative work, maybe with a little bit of help from the radio. And many years later, since he was from Pensacola, Florida, I called on him again for some assistance. The incident in Okinawa I wanted to tell you about, he was credited with saving the life of a child there on the island. There was a type of very poisonous snake, a pit viper, called the habu snake, was very prevalent out there in Okinawa, and in particular on this little island that we lived on. The little boy stepped out of his house one night, and the snake bit him in both heels, both legs. And there were helicopters during those days there in 1957 and 58, and this had happened just before I got there in 57. But they didn't fly at night in those days. And so the chief cared for the boy all during the night, and the Army and the Marine Corps got a helicopter out there at first light and took him to the hospital, and the Navy doctors, or the Army doctors there in Okinawa, said that if it hadn't been for the treatment that the chief had given him during the night, the kid couldn't have survived. His legs swelled so bad that Chief Steele had to actually cut slits in the skin to keep the skin from just tearing on his legs. He was so swollen. But the chief had worked on him most of the night, trying to get as much poison out of him as he could, you know, and keeping him alive until they could get him over to Okinawa. Oh, one other incident about the habu snakes. I noticed on the Liberty truck, that is the truck that took guys to the village, on that one road that we had that went down through the farm fields over there, they grew primarily sugar cane and sweet potatoes as a money crop, and there were a few fishermen on the island. That was the entire economy of this little island our station was on. Right behind the cab, behind the driver's seat on this 3/4 ton pickup truck, was a thing that looked like a rapier, or a, when people are sword fighting, what do you call that? When they wear a mask and poke at each other with a sword? What is that called? I can't think what it is. Anyway, what this thing looked like was, it looked like a fence. It looked like the swords that are used for fencing. It looked like somebody had taken maybe a radio antenna or something and put a handle on it and then put a protector around the hand. And it was sticking right behind the driver's seat. I said, what in the world is that? And they said, that's Flash's habu killer. And I said, what? He said, that's Flash's habu killer. Well, Flash was an engineman on the station, a fireman as a matter of fact, who did a lot of the duty driving. And he had the record for killing more habu snakes than any other crew member on the Coast Guard station.
And that tool was what he used to kill them with. I said, well, why, how in the world does he ever stick a snake with a thing like that?
Foil.
Yes, a foil, okay. Well, he said he don't stick them with it, he hits them with it, you know, so he would just whip them, you know, just hit them with that sharp thing, and that's how he killed his habus. And so many times when he was driving between the station and the village, he'd catch a habu crossing the road, and he'd just reach behind the seat, get his habu killer, and get him another habu. I think he'd killed like 17 habus during that year when he was out there. That was a young fellow from Van Nuys, California. Okay, I guess that's all of the Okinawa and Loran and habu stories I'll tell you. What happened to me then was I came back to the United States, and my family had not told me because they knew exactly when I was due home. My father was recuperating from a second very severe heart attack. He was in a hospital bed at home. And so the decision was quickly made that since I had completed my obligated service to the Coast Guard, was to get out of the Coast Guard and try to run the family business and keep him away from it.
That's 5 years of service.
Yeah, well, it's actually, we had a 4-year obligation. In fact, the class before us, the class of '53, only had a 3-year obligation. But our obligation was 4 years, and I had almost 4.5 years at the time. And I was scheduled to go through Merchant Marine Inspection School and be stationed in New Orleans at the Marine Inspection Office in New Orleans. However, I wrote to the Coast Guard then, and since normally it would take about 6 months to process a resignation, I said it seemed unreasonable for them to spend money training me for something that I probably was not going to do, and they agreed and sent me orders to report to New Orleans and mustered me out within about 30 days, I think, or 60 or so. I had 30 days compensatory absence coming anyway, see, from the period of isolated duty. So I then became the chief flunky, that is, vice president of Two Crooks Incorporated, and chief flunky, truck driver, you name it. We were, at that time, the largest fuel oil dealer in Panama City, and as a matter of fact, held some Coast Guard contracts. We used to supply fuel to the Cardigan then, as a matter of fact. We used to bid on government contracts for the Coast Guard and for the Navy and for the Air Force Base. Had a huge Air Force base called Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama City. And we were successful in holding those contracts for several years. But we also operating a couple of service stations, and the business world being dog-eat-dog like it is, and the major oil companies having a tendency to want to put the little guys out of business with price wars, we took our lumps. And so about 4 years later, I was still making a little less than I had been when I was in the Coast Guard, and the business was not really making a good living for both my father's family and mine. I applied to the U.S. Navy, what at that time was called the Navy Mine Defense Laboratory in Panama City, Florida, for a job as an engineer, and sure enough was hired, and went directly in 1963 to work for the Navy in mine sweeping development, research development, test and evaluation. And I did that then for, well, until 1958, I guess it was, 1957. So for 24 years then, I worked as an engineer for the Navy and stayed active in the Coast Guard Reserve and moved on up through the ranks in the Coast Guard Reserve.
Would you repeat your arithmetic? You said 57 or 77 if you had 20 years?
No, 87.
87.
Yeah, I retired in 1987 from the U.S. Navy as a civilian engineer. And during those times too, I had contacts with the Coast Guard over the years. Had some of the Coast Guard, had 2 of the Coast Guard commandants come through Panama City to see what kinds of things were being done there in mine warfare. And we also did work for the Coast Guard. Some of the good work that was done was a high-speed tow vehicle for some of the containment booms, some of the oil containment booms. Our engineering department there at Panama City developed a hull that would when it was sitting still, it would sink into the water and just barely stay awash. You know, it would stay right at the surface. You could load the, you could just pull these, you know what I mean by containment booms.
Yes.
Now, the flotation devices with a skirt maybe that will contain oil spills and whatnot. You can put that into this hull and lash it in, and then as you start towing, the boat dewaters itself, or the hull dewaters itself, because it's open on the rear end, and then the tow craft can just go faster and faster and faster, and finally it'll become a planing hull, and you can go get to where you need to be fairly fast. Then you stop, it again just sinks down in the water, and you pull the boom out rather fast. But I didn't work on those types of things. I worked in mine countermeasures all the time. But I did have an opportunity, as I worked for the Navy and stayed active in the Coast Guard Reserve, and as I said, moving on up through the chairs, I did a good bit of traveling for the Navy, and traveled to places like Israel and Egypt and the UK, Japan, the Philippines, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and Cambodia. And in Vietnam in particular, since I was missing I spent a 4.5-month tour in South Vietnam in '67, and a 4-month tour in '69, and other trips of several weeks duration in '71 and '72, and then into the minesweeping operation where I had my leg broken in North Vietnam. Probably was around 73, or could have even been 75. I can't remember now. But while I was over in Vietnam, see, I was missing Coast Guard Reserve drills, and that wasn't doing me any good career-wise in the Coast Guard Reserve. So one of the things I did when I went to Vietnam, I took a set of TDY orders for the Coast Guard Reserve, and I spent 1 day of active duty. It was the only whole day I had off in 4.5 months from the Navy work that we were doing. We worked long hours. We worked 7 days a week over there. But I had a Saturday off 1 day, and I went down to Coast Guard Squadron 1 and checked in at, they were located in the same building as Commander Naval Forces Vietnam, Command 4V. And they assigned me that day to a commander who was being relieved. His relief was there, and he was, if I'm not mistaken, it was called the Inland Waterways Security Detail. And I told you on the phone the other day, a lot of people didn't know how much activity the Coast Guard had in Vietnam, but they had Coast Guard Squadron 1, which had charge of the ships that were on patrol, providing naval gunfire support in some cases. They had this Inland Waterways Security Detail. They had an ammunition safety team that was located at several places like Cat Lai outside of Saigon, where a lot of ammunition, well, it was an Army ammunition depot, as a matter of fact, on one of the rivers. And then they also, our present commandant, Paul Yost, was stationed down at, this was in '69, he was stationed down at Vung Tau, where the entrance to the Long Tau River is. It carried all the river traffic up to Saigon, all the ship traffic. He was in charge of probably what was called Coastal Surveillance Squadron 1 or Squadron 4 or whatever, but it was about a fourth of the whole country of South Vietnam that he was in charge of all the coastal patrols for that area, both Navy and Coast Guard boats. You know, we had our 82-footers over there doing those patrols. In fact, it was our 82-footers that had the staying power when the monsoon season came along. The Navy was using swift boats, and they couldn't hang in there with that rough weather like our 82-footers could. I've had the Navy people tell me time and time again, you know, what punishment it was to be on a swift boat as compared to be on a Coast Guard 82-footer, because we had the boats that were designed to be habitable even in that bad weather. But so I did get to, I actually visited.
You had 1 day of active duty.
One day of active duty, yeah, in the war zone, and got to visit with Admiral Yost down in Vung Tau when I was on a trip down. We were working in my laboratory was primarily responsible for swimmer defense, that is defense against swimmer sappers, and mine defense. My specialty, of course, was mine defense, but when you go on a detail like that, you work in whatever area they need you in. So we happened to be in Vung Tau on a swimmer defense problem when I got to see Admiral Yost. But it has certainly been a pleasure to have been associated with all the nice Coast Guard people over the years. And it makes the world small, too. I'll tell you 2 incidences of how small the world can be. This was, again, during this time period of probably, well, it was the Vietnam era. I had a classmate who was a flyer named, oh my goodness, I'll think of that in a minute. I had his name on the tip of my tongue until I started to say it. Bunk Mizell. And he was assigned some independent duty with the Air Force. The Air Force was going to evaluate what was called Loran D, a tactical Loran. Now they were already using, or at some time during the Vietnam War, we set up Loran chains with a very high accuracy in Thailand and whatnot, and they were used by the B-52s for bombing. They were actually navigating by Coast Guard Loran station when they were unloading some of those big planes full of bombs over there. Well, they wanted a close-in, high-accuracy navigation system, and Bunk was assigned to the Air Force for the evaluation of this Loran D system. And they had it installed in an aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base, which is only about 50 miles from Panama City. Well, I happened to be in New Orleans for a Coast Guard Reserve officer meeting, walking through a hotel lobby, and I hear somebody say, "There's Crook Stewart." Well, I look around, and here's Bunk Mizell with another officer and his wife, and Bunk's wife. The other officer was out of the class of 53. It might have been Matson, I'm not sure, but he was skipper on a buoy tender in Mobile. They were in New Orleans, and here we were, both of us away from home, meeting accidentally. Well, 6 months later, I was in Vietnam. I was walking down the sidewalk at Tonsanute Air Force Base, and I see a khaki overseas cap coming toward me with a Coast Guard Eagle on it. And I look at the face, and there's Bunk Mizell, and he's out there with his airplane equipped with Loran D during this evaluation. Here we are halfway around the world, and we meet each other, you know. About 6 months later, I'm in Mobile, Alabama for a Coast Guard Reserve drill, and I never went to the mall but this one time in maybe 6 years of drilling in Mobile. And here I walk into Bunk Mizell and his wife and 2 kids in the mall, and here we are again, both, you know, 160 miles from home. And that was 3 times in 1 year, and once halfway around the world. In Brussels about 3 years ago, I was representing the Navy in a NATO mechanical mine countermeasures meeting. And when I got on the train at the airport in Brussels to go into the city, to the hotel where I was going to stay, I saw a face at the glass door at the end of the train car that looked awfully familiar to me. And I said, you know, I know that face. And if that guy comes into this car, I'm going to find out who it is, because I know it from somewhere. Well, the train finally started to leave the air terminal, and sure enough, the guy did appear at the door again and came on into the car, and I just reached out and grabbed him by the coat sleeve, and I said, "My name's Crook Stewart, and I think I know you." And he did a double take at me, and he said, "I'm Jim Dowdy," and that's my classmate, Jim Dowdy, from, I think, maybe even Washington State. Jim was working for Boeing. He was over there teaching the engineering systems on the Boeing 737 to Sabina Air Crews in Brussels. So anyway, the last time I had seen him or talked to him, I guess, was back in about 1965 or so. I was on active duty with the captain of the port in Savannah. And
what's that, a Sony?
Yes.
He was at the air station in Savannah.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had not seen each other then for, say, 20 years or so, and I ran into him in Brussels. had one other small world story, but I can't recall what that one is. So let me ask you about a couple of officers that were the senior officers on my first Coast Guard cutter and see whether you know either one of those. It sort of led to a bad morale problem, I think. The acting CO, when I went aboard, we didn't have a CO when I first went on the Sebago. The acting CO was a fellow by the name of Harry Fraser. Did you ever know a
Yes,
Fraser?
I know of him, but it's been, I can't tell you
He would
where he is
all right.
now.
Well, I know. He wrote to me about 4 or 5 years ago about he got concerned about some of the tax treatment that retired pay was getting, or something that was about to happen, and he wrote to me to get in touch with my congressman, about it. And that's the first contact I've had since Mobile, Alabama, back in the 54, 55 time frame. But he's living in Delaware, I believe, but he's retired, of course, many years ago.
Okay, he's at Lewes, Delaware.
Okay. The other one was Ecopoy. Have you ever heard E.C. Allen, Jr.
Eddie Allen.
Okay. He was a legal, he was a lawyer. He was another one of those that was in the legal profession. He came aboard as CO. He was a full commander. Perry was a full commander and had been acting CO for like 6 months or so. Commander Allen came aboard as the CO. That meant that Harry had to move back to be the XO, which is what he was assigned on the Sebago as. So that left us with 2 full commanders on board. Here we were on this big ship with half of the Sebago crew and half the Tampa crew. And Commander Allen was a little concerned because, I guess being a lawyer, he knew the severity of command or whatnot. And so we spent a lot of our time in a Bravo 2 status, meaning 2-hour standby for patrols. And we pulled a bunch of those during hurricanes in the Gulf. But during that period, we had that ship's crew standing port and starboard liberty. And if you can imagine a 255-foot cutter with the crew on port and starboard liberty for weeks at a time, we had a morale problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I did a little growing up then too. I took a few knocks, but I learned some lessons. I was not doing myself nor the service nor the crew any good, but I was siding with the crew in that little conflict about whether we ought to be on port and starboard liberty, and I found out that was the wrong spot to be in. And that was the only time I think I was thinking about that the other day. I went to a public health service doctor there in Mobile, and he prescribed some belladonna for me. I think I actually was about to have an ulcer from the situation that I was in there on that ship, but since I've never had to have any of that since then, I think it was probably a helpful situation for me. It didn't feel very helpful at the time. Are there any questions you have for me or anything that's come to mind that you might want to know about in that period of time?
I think you have done a splendid job of covering a career, both active duty in the Coast Guard and associated with the Coast Guard after you left the active duty status. And I can't think of anything further to ask you.
Let me mention a couple of things that come to mind. I told you that we had some of the commandants come through Panama City.
Yes.
In fact, since the CO at the COs at the station that I worked for there, the Mine Defense Lab, and later what is now the Naval Coastal Systems Center, they all knew that I was a Coast Guard officer, and that's another thing I guess I should mention that the Coast Guard Academy, I think, does for you. It makes you into a military person. I never really have thought of myself as a civilian, even though I lived a lot of my life as a civilian, had a civilian career. I always considered myself to be a Coast Guard officer who happened to be in a civilian capacity a good bit of the time. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you just how important that was. I did a lot of research and development work on Navy minesweepers. And one time, and this is probably unheard of. I can't imagine how it happened, but I had spent a good bit of time on the bridge talking to the CO of this minesweeper, Ocean, MSO, which is our large class of minesweepers. We still have 20-something of them left, I guess, in the Navy. We were coming in from some tests, and there's a fairly small channel and area where the ships of that size have to tie up there at the laboratory. And this fella offered me the con. This commanding officer, a Navy CO, offered me, a Navy civilian engineer, the con to tie the ship up. And of course I accepted it. And the ship had to be turned around and then docked. And I got it into a turn, and the ship was turning. It was doing just exactly what it needed to be doing, and so I called for all stop. And I was just going to I left the rudder the way it was and everything else. Wind, current, there was almost no current, had a little wind. When I went to all stop, the ship reacted differently than I expected. And I got this puzzled look on my face and looked at the captain. And he said, "Go ahead, don't worry, I'll tell you what happened later." Anyway, I added some, put the engine back where it should have been, or where I needed to get to finish the evolution there and get tied up. And when we got tied up and he and I got a chance to discuss it, that was the first ship that I had ever conned that had variable pitch propellers. And when you go to all stop, you're just dragging two big discs behind you, and that's the reason the ship stopped the turn that it was making, because I was dragging these two big propellers still turning but with no pitch on them behind me. And of course it became perfectly clear then what needed to have been done, But it was kind of an unsettling feeling when you got everything going just right and you do all stop and everything starts changing, But that was I thought for one thing, he was a brave commanding officer to have done that, but it also paid credit to the Coast Guard for him to feel like he could put that kind of trust in a fellow that was just talking a good war with him, Another thing that was pleasant for me, like I said, I got assigned because the commanding officers there knew that I was a Coast Guard officer or a reserve officer. I was put in charge of a couple of the commandant's visits. Admiral Jack Hayes was one of the commandants that came and visited while I was there at Panama City. There's one that's probably, if he hasn't visited, not a commandant, but if he hasn't visited, the district commander will probably be visiting over there, because Bill Merlin, who is the commander of the 8th District now, was stationed in Panama City as CO of the Dependable. And as you know, that's why Rick Caroni has retired there, because he was stationed there on the Dependable. And of course, it was I got to interface with those Coast Guard officers who came through on the Cardigan and on the Dependable over the years. In fact, Jim Swint, that I mentioned earlier to you, actually brought the Coast Guard cutter Reliance to Panama City years before the Dependable was stationed there, just to show the people of Panama City what type of cutter was eventually going to be stationed there. And he invited me to fly out on the helicopter and land on the Reliance, and then come into port with him when he brought the Reliance down to the City Marina, downtown Panama City. That was another pleasant experience that I got to take part in.
Swint is your classmate?
No, Swint was the one that I said was my assistant sailing coach at the academy. He was my physics instructor also at the academy. And he had been an enlisted man before he went through the Coast Guard Academy. So he was pulling those horse patrols on the beach in Panama City.
That's the one, yes.
Right.
That's right.
And he's retired now in Portsmouth, Virginia. He's refurbished an old 2-story or 3-story home up there in Portsmouth.
He's on the list of people that I will see this
Is that
trip.
right? Well, you tell him hi from Crook, please.
He's my former landlord in Juneau for
Is that
1
right?
month.
Is that right? So you know he and Phyllis, I say.
No.
You don't know Phyllis? Okay. Well, tell them both hi for me.
I'll do that.
And that's about it, I guess, as far as...
Well, I have certainly enjoyed sitting here and listening to your career, your memories of your career. It's a most interesting story, and I want to thank you for being so forthcoming with your recollections.
It's been my pleasure.